Welcome. Tonight we're going to go through some basic chess endings taken from the Teresh Book of Chess, written in 1935. He has a whole section on endings. We're going to take a chapter on pawn endings first. King and pawn versus king. There are some surprising tricks that you need to know about to handle these properly. Then I think we'll have time to get into rook and pawn endings, basically a rook and pawn and king versus king and rook. And the author, Teresh, says that these can be some of the most difficult endings in all of chess. So we'll start with the simpler king and pawn endings. So here's our first example. I'll get rid of the solution. White to play and win. This is a winning position, but it has to be done properly. Now, obviously, the white king and pawn have to advance up to the board, and the pawn has to go to f8 and become a queen to win. And for the pawn to get to f8, the white king has to be either at g7 or e7 to protect the f8 square, so the pawn can go to the 8 square protected and become a queen. So the f8 square, that's called the queening square. Now, what you need to know, rather than have our audience guess at it, let me state the principle. The principle is that the king with the pawn has to be in front of the passed pawn to win. If the king is behind the pawn, the game becomes a stalemate. When the king and pawn advance as far as they can, the black king blocks the pawn from the 8th rank. The white king protects the pawn from the 6th rank and there are no squares for the black king to move. It becomes a stalemate. So the solution, the mistake that would be made would be 1 f4, moving the pawn first. The correct move is to move the king in front of the pawn. You only move the pawn after you get your king advanced far enough along. So the right move is king to g2, which we'll do here. Now black has to block the passed pawn. His moves are very simple. He's just going to move over in front of the pawn. So he moves king to g7 is the direct route. White moves up to the 3rd rank beside the pawn, not in front of it yet. Black moves up to block the white king from going beyond the 4th rank. White king moves up, and noticed that the kings have 1 square between them. That's called the opposition in chess. The person who has to move is at the disadvantage. It's black's move. Black can't move forward, you see, because the white king guards the 3 squares in front of the black king. The black king either has to move backwards or to the side. That's a concession in chess. Now, obviously, the king doesn't want to move backwards because that would give white could advance his king to the 5th row. Equally obvious, the black king will not move to the H file because he wants to stay in front of the passed pawn. So the only move that makes sense for black is king to f6. Now, it would be a mistake. White does not have his king far enough advanced yet to move his pawn up. So the correct move is the king move to take the opposition again and force the black king to either side of the passed pawn. Now we have a real concession once that happens. So king to f4. Now, black could move back. That's what white wants. If black moves back, we just advance and take the opposition again. Now, black's choice, and it doesn't matter which way he goes because he loses either way. He either goes to the left or right, so he either goes to E6 or G6. It doesn't matter. So he goes to G6. Notice that we can now advance our king to the 5th row by moving to the left of the black king. See how we're making headway and we're preparing the path for the pawn to advance toward the 8th file. So king to E5. Notice that the black king cannot approach the passed pawn because we can advance our pawn 2 squares with check. And the king can't go forward because our passed pawn would go past the king and become a queen. So the king would have to move back to G6, and then we can move our king up 1 square to E6, taking the opposition. In this case, it's side-by-side opposition, it's lateral opposition, and black's king would have to move back to G7. So black has to give way. His best try is to stay in front of the passed pawn, is probably king to F7. Let's see what black does. Okay, he goes to F7. Now, we're on the 5th row. We're far enough advanced, we could move our passed pawn up 2 squares, but the easier way to win is to take the opposition again, forcing black back once more. So that's what we do. Now again, see how we pushed black back? Now black can go to either side. A couple moves ago, he was on the 6th rank and had to give way. Now we pushed him to the 7th and he has to give way. Now he goes to the left, or to E7. So we can advance our king to G6 to the right, which we do. Now, if he advances his king up 1 square, we advance our pawn 2 squares and take away the E5 square from the king, and then we can move our pawn to F5 check, forcing the king back. So if black takes the lateral opposition of white's king, it doesn't do him any good because we move our passed pawn now. See how our king is basically 3 rows, actually 4 rows in front of the pawn, but the pawn catches up quick because he moves the 2 squares for his first move. So black dropped back to stay in front of the passed pawn. Now we can grab the opposition. Black has to go to one side or the other, but see, black's now back against the furthest corner. Now, we can't go to E7 and guard the F8 square yet because our pawn's not close enough, or the black king could go to G7 and then move up and stop the pawn. So now it's time to advance the pawn. So we take the 2 squares. Notice that we have another move by the pawn. So black can move to over 1 square, taking the opposition. And remember, white moves, so white would have to give way, except for the fact we don't move the king, we move the pawn up. That makes black move. White has the opposition. Black has to give way. Our pawn is within reach of our king on G7 or E7. We advance our king and we guard the queening square, and we just march our pawn up and get a queen. So the king blocks. This is the best move, but it doesn't do black any good. See how we do the pawn move and it switches now? Black has to move. White has the opposition. Black has to give way to one side or the other. Then we get our king up, and when we started out, we said we had to get the king to E7 or G7 to guard the F8 square. Now we've done that, and there's no way black can stop the pawn from becoming a queen. and it's an easy checkmate. So the principle to keep in mind, you want the king not just one square in front of the pawn, preferably 2 squares. That gives you 2 pawn moves to play with to get the opposition back if black gets in front of your king. Now in this case, remember I said the ideal would be if the king was 1 or 2 squares in front of the, well, had a space between the pawn and the king. Here there is none. So there's no pawn move to give white, for white to get a temple. Say it's white's move, he has to give way. Black has the opposition. White has to go to the left or the right, and then black can block him again. Now if it was black's move, white would have the opposition and black would have to give way, and white would win easily if it's black's move. Let's say black moved king to g7. What's the winning move for white? Feel free to chime in. King e6, and then you see black is nothing better than moving his king to f8, and we move our king over to f6, take the opposition and force him aside, and then we grab the queening square. The answer is, though white wins, it depends on whose move it is. If it's black's move, white wins because white would have the opposition and black would have to give way. On the other hand, if it's white's move, it's a draw. So we've gone through the win. Let's go through the draw. Okay, so the draw would go like this. King here, black takes the opposition. See, we can't advance our king and force black back to the first row. Do you see that? So we have nothing, and if we go back in front of the pawn, he just moves his king in front, and we repeat the position over and over again, which would be a draw. So the only try is to move the pawn up. Now, let me think. The correct move is to move in front of the pawn. See, we don't let the white king get in front of the pawn now. Now, if the white king moves back, we just move the black king to f6. So the pawn has to go up. Now, there's only one defensive move for black. He has to move straight back, because if white moves the king up, black has to take the opposition. You see that? Now, if white goes to the left side, it doesn't make any sense. Black king moves up next to the pawn, f7, and threatens king takes pawn, forcing white to go back. So to advance, white does the check. Now the king moves over, and the only move to protect the pawn is to move here. And notice that white just took away all black's moves. Black can't move. It's draw by stalemate. That is what happens if you don't have your king at least one square in front of. You can be in front of the pawn if it's your opponent's move. If it's your move, the pawn has to be 2 squares behind the king so that you can waste a move with the pawn, and that changes the move to black to move, and he has to give way. Now, this is a little bit like our last example, but everything has been moved up 1 row. So the white king is now on the 6th, and the pawn is on the 5th. Remember and the black king is back on the 8th. Now remember, we just went over it and we said it depended on who moved. If black had to move white 1, If white had to move, it was a draw. Now, if this is the same, it would logically mean that if black had to move, he would lose. So let's say black moves to e8. We can take the queening square away from black by king to g7, and then we just move our pawn up 3 squares. That's a simple win. Now let's look at white's move. The question is it a draw or a win for white? Anyone have an opinion on that? White to move, is it a win or a draw? A win, you're right. Let's look at it. The king moves here. Black moves here. Pawn moves here. King has to go here. Now we advance the pawn, and look, the pawn guards the square in front of the white king, the e8 square, so the black king can't take the opposition. The black king is forced to give way to the side of the board, giving up the queening square, and we advance and we get the queen in checkmate. So the answer is that the fact that the starting position is up 1 square, the king on the 6th pawn, white wins no matter whose move it is. Now this one is simpler. It's a rook pawn. Who knows the rule? Rook pawns are often draws. Who knows the rule for a draw? What's the rule? Black king is where it's a draw. The corner's a draw, but he doesn't even have to be in the corner. What square does he have to be on to be a draw? All he has to get to is the f8 square, 1 square to the left. Now he's 1 square to the right, which is even better for black. In the corner, like you said, is even better. Because with a rook pawn, the white king can't go around to the other side and force the king out of the corner. So the move goes king to h8. Now if the white king moves anywhere, the black king moves up and attacks the pawn. White can't make any progress. And if he advances the rook pawn, it's an immediate stalemate. There are no moves for black king to get out of the corner. Hi. Here's another rook pawn. Now remember I said the black king had to be to the bishop file. F8 was the first example, but it works on the queen side, but it would be c8. But he can't get to c8. Notice that the white king blocks the passed pawn, right? The only way white can get a queen is if he can move his king to the right, allowing the pawn to advance, correct? So the defense that draws is to move the black king in opposition to the white king, so the king can't move over to the right side. So the correct move is king here. Notice that the white king can't go to b7, b6, or b5. He can only advance. And now we can maintain the opposition. We move our king up. See, we follow him up and down, and he can never move away from in front of his pawn. And so it's a draw. This is the other way to get a draw with the rook pawn. So he advances the pawn. We go to the c8 square. He advances the king. We go here. He advances the pawn. We go up there. Now the white king is stalemated. The king can't move at all, and the pawn can't move. It's a draw by stalemate. This is a different example altogether. The purpose of this example is, the question is, whose move is it, white or black? Let's say it's white's move. Now, the white king is in the corner and is blocked by the black king, so the white king cannot help the pawn. The only question is, can that pawn advance to the g8 square and become a queen before the black king can stop it? Now there's two, so we're only talking about the white pawn moving straight ahead, move after move, and black king moving along the diagonal to try to intercept it. There's two ways to calculate this. The first is counting the moves. Let's count the white moves. The first move would be pawn to g4, 1, and then it would go up 2, 3, 4, 5. It takes 5 moves for white to get a queen. Now let's count how many moves. When the white pawn gets to g7, threatening g8 queen, the black king has to move to f7, where it guards the queening square. See that? How many moves does it take the black king to get to f7? So we count those. So let's go b4, 1, c5, 2, d6, 3, e7, 4, f7, 5. So that takes 5 moves for both sides. But remember, white's 5th move, white moves first, and his 5th move is to get a queen. When white makes the 5th move, black's king isn't close enough. So let's walk through it. So that's 1 each, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. You see, we're ready to queen, and black is a move short, even though it was both 5, because white moved first. Black doesn't have time. Okay, now if black's move, now black has 5 moves, but he goes first, so now he can stop the pawn. He moves his king here, here, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, and we make our 5th move because black moved first and he stops the pawn. That's counting moves. There's an easier technique, a geometric technique, where you don't have to count moves at all. The way it is, there's called the square, and it's named after a German chess master who discovered this technique, called Burger's square. His name was Burger. You take the pawn and you go straight up to the queening square to g8. That's one part of the square. Or you take the pawn and you take that diagonal f4, e5, d6, c7, b8, and you make a square, and it comes back next to the black king. You see the corner is on b3. So you see that imaginary square the pawn makes? The rule is if black can move into the square, he can stop the pawn. Now, because the square goes from g3 to g8 to b8 to b3, the black king can enter the square either on b3 or b4 and stop the pawn. So if you know the square rule, you don't have to count the moves. But you need to know how to count moves, because sometimes there are other endings and the square rule doesn't apply, but you can always count moves. So it's helpful counting moves is helpful in almost every ending. Okay, so anyway, that's that. And it's important to know that square rule. The principle is, see how there are two passed white pawns and only one black pawn. Now, notice that the white king can easily stop the black pawn from becoming a queen because the king is in the black pawn square. Only if it's white's move. Because the black pawn can move two squares, right? And his first move would be h5, so we have to make the square from h5. And, oh, okay, it can run down to D, see how it runs down to d1 and h1. So the white king can enter the square. White doesn't have to move to stop the pawn, he just moves his king over. But when white moves his king over, that'll leave his pawn on c3 unprotected, and it looks like black can take the pawn on c3 and then move over and take the pawn on h2 for a draw. But there's a technique when you have two passed pawns separated by a file, you can move the pawns up so that the opposing king can't take either pawn. So the pawns actually can defend each other even though they're not in contact with each other. So let's look and see how that works. To do it correctly, you have to move the backward pawn up 2 squares. Now, notice what that did. Black moves his pawn up and the white king leaves the c3 pawn. The black king, though, can't take the c3 pawn because he would be behind the a4 pawn, which could advance to become a queen. See that? That's how the two pawns defend each other, by moving up, and when the king goes to one side, the other pawn has to advance, and then the king can't take it because it would run to be a queen. So we'll see this pattern. Black moves his pawn, the king has to come over and stop it. Okay, so the king gets there just in time to stop the black pawn. Now you see that black could take the pawn, but then he can't stop the a pawn from advance because his king would be behind the pawn, you see that, and he can't catch it. So the king has to move back from the c3 pawn, which he does. We move our king next to that pawn. We're going to kill off the black pawn as soon as we can. Now the king goes here, and black threatens to get a draw by king to a5, attacking the a4 pawn, taking that pawn. Then he can come and get the c3 pawn. Now this is how the top pawns protect each other. The backward pawn advances, see that? Now, whichever pawn the king attacks, the other pawn moves up, and the king can't take the backward pawn because the other pawn would become a queen. So in this case, he goes king to a5. Now we advance the pawn, and notice the king can't take the a4 pawn. That gives the white king a temple to kill off the black pawn, which he does. Black now goes in front of the advanced pawn. So now that you know the pattern, what's the winning move for white here? A5, exactly right. Now the same pattern. What's the move? A6. Right. So the king now we can bring our king over to support one of the passed pawn on c5, and we'll get our queen. And it's even worse here because the king is now can't even get in front of the pawn, so we don't even have to get the king over there. We're going to get the queen next move. So if you ever find yourself with two disconnected pawns, against one, you have an opportunity to win the game. So you need to remember that principle. White has an obvious advantage, a protected passed pawn. There's no, the only question is, can black draw the game or not? The short answer is black is lost, but there's an ending trick that white has to use to win the game. Let's say, well, the white king can obviously advance to f6 and try to come around the right side and then force the black king back. So the obvious move is king to f6. So let's do that move. Now, black's trying to hold the draw. What is black's best move to try to hold the draw? D8 is better. Now, remember, if you're defending or attacking, you want to take the opposition. Ordinarily, the opposition is one king in front of the other or side by side. That's called vertical. Side by side is lateral. They have diagonal. In this case, black king took diagonal opposition. That's the best move. Let's show what happens if he doesn't, because it's a very simple win. Let's say he goes over here. Then we see how we grab the opposition. We force him over. Now we advance the pawn, and he can't stop the queen, and it's checkmate in a couple moves. But look how difficult it is if he makes the right move. Now, let's say we come this way. What's his move now? E8. He takes the opposition, and we check him. He blocks the pawn. Oops, stalemate. The king can't move. We messed up. Okay. Yeah, so, well, let's try this though. We're not done yet. We said king here, right? No, wait a minute. King here. We tried king to e6 and it didn't work, right? Let's try king here. See how that works for us.
Then your horizontal opposition.
Well, he takes horizontal opposition and he holds off. And if white goes up a square, we go back a square. And if he goes back to f6, we take diagonal opposition. We repeat position. White can't make headway. Here's where the trick comes in. This is still a winning position. The correct move is to sacrifice that protected passed pawn, and then we grab the opposition and force the king away from his pawn on c6. So that's the trick. Who would have thought you would give up your protected passed pawn? See how we take the opposition, lateral opposition, forcing black to give way. And look, we force him away from the pawn and we win the king and pawn ending. So these king and pawn endings can be tricky. Now, I'm sure you guys recognize this position. 3 pawns against 3. The kings are off to the side. They have nothing to do with it. White can force through a passed pawn and win the game. What's the winning move?
B6.
Which one?
B6.
B6. And if I take this way, what do you do?
Then I push on. You go C6.
C6. That's absolutely correct. If pawn takes the A pawn, you take the B7 pawn and you get your queen. And if I take this pawn, you push this one and you got your queen. Okay. Now, if I take this way, what's the winning move? A6 in this case. And it's very similar to the last example. And so it doesn't happen very much, but you would feel very foolish if you had that position and you didn't win it. So put it in your bag of tricks for endings. What's white's winning move? You're absolutely correct. That holds back the black pawn to the third, which is very important, the 6th row. Then the white king can come over just 2 squares. The pawn can't advance, and the black king can get to the pawn in 2 squares. But if white plays his cards right, black will have to move away from protecting the pawn. So you got to make the right follow-up moves. But Dennis, you found the key move. Black goes here. What does white do? King where?
C6 or C7.
Yeah, either one. Now, if black goes here, what's the winning move?
It's King D7 and then
King D7, right. King D6 would be a gross blunder because he could play king up and white would have to move away from his pawn. But you had the right move. Now what's the winning move?
now King.
How about...
I know, it's King D8 and then King
Yeah.
somewhere, King E7.
Wait. Here. Wait a minute. Wait, right here. See, he can't advance. See, if black could have gotten to the square F5, protected the pawn and attacked the white pawn, and it was white's move, white would have to move away. But because we came here, attacking the pawn, and he had to go here, now he can't get to F5. And our pawn covers F6, so he can't go there. We just go back here, and he has to move away from the pawn, and we win. But you're right, you could have moved the king up, and you would get back to the same kind of position. Okay. All right. That's it for the king and pawn endings. Now we still have about 12 minutes, so I'd like to go into the 2 key critical positions on rook and pawn endings. Because the author says these king and pawn endings were fairly tricky, wouldn't you say? The rook and pawn endings are even trickier. But there's some basic positions that have been figured out that we can go over that help understand it. This is a known drawn position determined by a Frenchman from the 1700s named Philidor, who was a famous chess player, and there's an opening in the Philidor defense named after him. But he did his best work in chess in analyzing simple endings like this one. And he determined that even though white is a pawn up, if black can put his king and rook in this position, he can hold the draw. So let's talk about the position. Notice that the king is directly in front of the white passed pawn. That's ideal. You have to have the king, almost always has to be blocking the pawn. There are a few exceptions where it can be a draw if the king's to the side, but much better to be in front. Now the other thing is, see how the rook is on the b6 square so that the white king cannot go past the 6th row. That keeps the king from coming up and threatening checkmate against the black king, which is already on the 8th row. Now the other element is to notice that the passed pawn that white has is the e pawn, and that there are 3 files to the right of the e pawn, right? and there are 4 files to the left. It turns out it's only a draw if the black rook is on the side of the pawn that has more files. If the black rook, let's say the white king was on d5, and the white rook was on a7, and the black rook was on g6, black would lose. Now the reason for that is it's advantageous for the black rook to be as far away from the white king as possible. Because let's say the king at some point advances in front of the pawn, goes to e5, there's a check, and the king goes to e6, there's a check, the king can go to d5. It doesn't threaten the rook. You see that? The rook's on the b file and the king's on the d file. If it was on the short side of the passed pawn, the king could move back and attack the rook, and the rook couldn't move away from the king. That makes all the difference between winning and losing. So what you have to remember when you're defending is your king has to be in front of the pawn on the queen square. Your rook has to be on the 6th row, but has to be on the side of the pawn that has more files. So that's the general principle. Now let's walk through it. The only way white can advance is to move his pawn up. It's black's move. Black stays on the 6th file. He moves back and forth between a6 and b6 until that pawn advances to e6, when the pawn blocks the effect of the rook and the white king can advance to f6, okay? So that's white's idea. Let's see how black defends. Moves his rook over, pawn up, he moves his rook back. Pawn up. If it was white's move, he would win the game by moving his king to f6, threatening rook up, checkmate, and the black king would have to move to the side and give up blocking the pawn. But because it's black's move, black can draw with what move? What rook move can black draw with? The threat is king to f6. We need to be able to check the king when it goes to f6. How can we do that?
Rook b1.
Rook to b1, that's absolutely right. And we harass the white king from the back row, and the king, notice that the pawn, there's no squares. The king can't get between the black king and the pawn, so that black can check forever. And if the king moves away from the pawn, black moves the rook to e1, attacking the pawn, forcing the king back, and then he can check. So this is a draw. So let's go back and just once again look at, see the starting position. This is called Philidor's drawing position. You have to know this to draw. And if you know this and you're a pawn up, you might be able to trick your opponent if he doesn't play the exact right sequence of moves. Now we have time for the next critical position, which is a position where white wins. Okay. This is called Lucena's winning position. Like the other position, it's a standard position. It was figured out by an Italian chess master back in the 1400s, or way long ago. Anyway, so it's surprising, but the white king has to be in front of the passed pawn, blocking the queening square. The pawn has to be on the 7th rank, and the rook has to be preventing the black king from approaching the pawn. You get to this position, you have a winning position for white. It's called Lucena's winning position. Let's walk through it real quickly. Black moves, he has to move along the rook file, the H file. If black were to move here, for example, white can move his rook and grab the file, then he can move his king over one square and force the pawn to queen with pawn to g8. And if black king comes up, it doesn't do him any good because the white rook moves to f1 check, forcing the king away from the queening square. So that's why black has to move somewhere along the H file with his rook. Now, white moves to the 5th row. Very important. He goes to the 5th row because his plan is to bring his king back. He's going to check the king, make the king move 2 squares away from the pawn. He's going to bring his king back to f7. The black's rook's going to check him. He's going to move his king now to g6. The rook's going to check him, but look, we have our rook on the 5th row where it can interpose between the king and the black rook, blocking the check, and then our pawn can queen the next move. Remember, the black king is 2 squares away from the pawn and can't help, and the black rook can't stop, and there's no defense to pawn up. So let's see how that goes. Rook here, check. See, the king is now 2 squares away from the passed pawn, can't help. Now we can move our king out from behind the pawn, the white king, check, here, check. They call this maneuver where you move the rook to the 5th row and then block the check. That's called building a bridge. And that's the key to winning many, many, many rook and pawn endings where you're a pawn up. You have to know that technique or it'll be a draw. So that'll be enough for tonight. Thank you.